Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I've listened intently to the contribution of members over the last 2 days almost, and I have been struck by a common theme that has come from all sides of politics, and that is finger-pointing. I've heard over and over from the government the problems we are now facing are as a result of Labor's poor management 7 years ago. And from the opposition, I've heard over and over again that the Liberals have had 7 years to fix it and have done nothing. Quite frankly, this level of debate, if you can call it that, gets Tasmanians nowhere. I don't particularly care whose fault it is. I'm more interested in what we're going to do to fix it. Whilst both sides of politics have admitted and recognised at various times there are elements of our economy which are doing extraordinarily well and going from strength to strength, all sides of politics have also admitted and recognised at various times there are people who are missing out. And it's those people who I want to speak about today, because that's really the challenge facing this Parliament today. How do we ensure that everyone in this state benefits from our prosperity? How do we make sure that no Tasmanian gets left behind? What can we do to ensure that we're looking after those people or communities who experience disadvantage? And that's the power of a budget. Mr Speaker, healthy Tasmanians are Tasmanians who can contribute and participate more in our community and in our economy. It is a universal priority for all members of this House, and I welcome the government's commitment to increase spending in this area. There is no doubt that an increase in spending to deliver more elective surgeries will help and be good news to those who have been suffering in pain on the waiting lists. And there is no doubt that funding for an additional 48 paramedics is going to go some way to reducing the growing pressures on Ambulance Tasmania. But I get a sense that we're chasing our tail with our health spending, and this is what I'm hearing consistently from people who talk to me about their concerns with the health system. It seems that we're constantly trying to play catch-up, spending more and more money just to manage the symptoms of our broken health system rather than treating the underlying condition. The underlying condition is the poor health of Tasmanians, putting pressure on our hospitals and health services. We have the unenviable title of being the country's unhealthiest state. We have the highest stress levels, body mass index, blood pressure and smoking rates in the country, with the highest rate of heart, stroke and vascular disease. We have the highest rate of chronic kidney disease, the highest rate of adult obesity and the highest incidence of depression. With these kind of indicators, unless there's urgent intervention, it is easy to see how health can become the bottomless pit in a budget. But that would make no sense economically, and it certainly doesn't look after the well-being of Tasmanians. It's not rocket science that investing in preventative and community health and keeping people well in the first place, or supporting people to live healthier lives, reduces over time the demand for acute health services. But it takes a bold government to not just pay lip service to this, but invest meaningfully, funding and investing heavily in these areas. It is an intergenerational investment in Tasmania's health that is needed. Another area where prevention is better all round and cheaper than the cure is in corrections. Again, I have no doubt that everyone in this chamber wants a safe Tasmania. But perversely, our ever-increasing budget commitments to building more prisons and housing more prisoners is having the very opposite effect. Our high recidivism rates are a testament to the mantra that jailing is failing. We're spitting out of our correction systems individuals who are not rehabilitated and ready to contribute to our community, but instead people who are leaving prison damaged, more broken than they went in, and with not nearly enough support around them to reintegrate and rehabilitate. This doesn't keep Tasmanians safe. It costs approximately $120,000 every year to keep a person in jail. Just imagine for a moment if sometimes, instead of jailing a person, we spent that money on addressing the reasons why they offended in the first place, or on protective measures to ensure that they don't offend again. Whilst I acknowledge and welcome some increase in funding for rehabilitative programs, in the context of the overall corrective service spend, it's clear that the priority is still on locking people up. Again, this is financially unsustainable and causing increasing social harm. Another example where we're at real risk of tipping more and more money into a bottomless pit rather than addressing the cause of the problem is transport. It has long been recognised that you cannot build your way out of traffic congestion. To the contrary, it's experienced communities all over the country, Tasmania included, that when we build another road or add another lane, it quickly fills up with more and more cars, adding to more and more traffic congestion. Traffic congestion comes at a social and environmental cost. It also comes at an economic cost too, with decreased productivity. An efficient and effective transport network supports our economy. Unfortunately, in Tasmania, we have for generations underfunded passenger transport, with the dollar spend per capita on public transport the lowest dollar spend per capita on public transport of any state. When we do this, we wonder why our traffic congestion problems continue to get worse. It is a definition of madness, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. It's like we're caught in an episode of the ABC classic Utopia. Mr. Speaker, my electorate office continues to be inundated with people experiencing housing stress. I'm hearing constantly from people who are paying a disproportionate amount of their household income on housing because the cost of private rental has skyrocketed. People who live in fear of yet another rent increase, because they're not coming in $10 increments anymore, they're coming in $50, $100, $200, $250 increments. I hear from people who just can't enter the housing market because they can't afford to save for a deposit. Because the rent takes so much of their income, there's nothing left at the end of the week to save. And the really heartbreaking ones, Mr. Speaker, are the ones where they are sleeping rough, couch surfing, or being shifted around from shelter to shelter with nothing but a seemingly never-ending wait for a home. These are people who, but for the grace of God, could be any one of us here in this chamber. Sometimes it's a sudden health issue, a loss of employment, a rent increase, domestic violence, family breakdown, or addiction that leads to them to be experiencing homelessness. Only last week, I had a young mum come into the office with 3 children, aged 10, 7 and 2, who was forced to leave her long-term public housing home where she'd been a model tenant for 9 years to escape domestic violence and protect herself and her children from a violent partner. That was 12 months ago, and since then she's reached her maximum stay at each of the women's shelters. She can't get private rental help because her impeccable housing record doesn't count as a reference in the private rental market. And at the end of this week, she's going to have no option but to sleep with her 3 children in her car. All because the government can't assist her with a home to keep her and her children safe. The ripple effect of homelessness cannot be underestimated. Someone who is homeless is more likely to have poor health. Someone who is homeless is less likely to engage in education and training. And someone who is homeless is more likely to be caught in the criminal justice system. This all takes taxpayers' resources, something that's entirely avoidable. Mr. Speaker, whilst I welcome an increase in spending to build new homes in the coming years, and I welcome increased spending in emergency or crisis accommodation, it's what happens between that first emergency or crisis and ultimately finding a new home where Tasmanians are falling through the cracks. They fall through the cracks when they have exhausted their allocated time in shelters or shelter accommodation is not suitable, but yet they still have some time to wait on the housing list. Talking about homes that will be ready in 2025 or later is cold comfort to these people. Mr. Speaker, again, I have no doubt that all members of this House would also agree that education is the key to young people thriving and is an important protective factor against social and economic disadvantage. So we think that given this universal understanding that any funding provided in education could be considered a long-term saving in other portfolios. However, again, we see consistently over many years a chronic underfunding of public education. We can't even fully fund the schooling resource standard. That's not a gold standard either, that's the bare minimum requirement, and we don't even meet that. It's hardly surprising that then we have poor literacy and numeracy outcomes. It's another false economy. Mr. Speaker, the Premier said repeatedly while delivering the budget that we were in a strong financial position with a strong economy. He then doubled down on this the next morning at the TCCI budget breakfast and said that his government was making intergenerational infrastructure investment. Every day I sit here and listen to the Dorothy Dixes from government backbenchers asking him and his ministers to outline how this Liberal government is working to secure Tasmania's future. But the answers we get are a mere regurgitation of the same stuff that governments of all persuasions have said for years. Same, different government. But if you're one of the Tasmanians on a hospital waiting list, things are getting worse. If you're one of the Tasmanians waiting for public housing, things are getting worse. If you're one of the Tasmanians in our public schools, your school still isn't being fully funded. If you're one of the Tasmanians tied up in the criminal justice system, either as a victim or offender, things are getting worse. If you're a Tasmanian caught in traffic congestion in your daily commute, things are getting worse. It's time to do something different. Mr Speaker, if Tasmania's economy is going so well as the Premier would have us believe, then I strongly suggest that there has never been a better time to be bold as a government and to make the intergenerational policy and funding shifts that actually address the root causes of disadvantage, rather than trying to bandage over a broken system. Mr Speaker, the people of Tasmania have given the government 4 more years to demonstrate their worth. The opposition are virtually missing in action. It's a unique position the government finds themselves in. My challenge to this government is this: don't squander the opportunity to do the right thing. You are making some of the right noises, and there's no doubt about that. And there are plenty of people to advise, encourage you, and who will back you in, especially in the community sector, if you start making some progressive and sustainable funding decisions. My bet is that if you did, then perhaps in 4 years' time, come the next election, the Premier's government would genuinely be known as a government that actually does secure the future for Tasmanians. Thank you, Mr Speaker.